Is there anything to say about the 50s?
Yeah, well, about the 50s. Well, I didn't tell you about my summers. Starting when I graduated high school, I used to go in the summer and work in Workman Circle Camp. It's a resort. It's a children and adults camp.
Put it up a little bit forward. It's farther away that way.
In upstate New York. And I was able to get a job there because your grandmother's older brother, Jakob, shall I wait?
Oh, go ahead.
Goes in the front.
You can go ahead.
Is it recorded?
Yes.
Yes.
Your grandmother's older brother, Jakob, was a big macher with the newspaper, Jewish Daily Forwards, and with the Workman Circle. And so I worked there every summer from except one, when I had to go to school, graduate from high school all the way through med school. The summer between my sophomore and junior year in med school, we had to go to school. So I missed that one summer, but I worked in camp 6 summers. Workman Circle was started by working people, socialists really, primarily Jewish, and this was a resort and children's camp. We used the same dining room, and I was, for most of the time, I was on the dining room staff, and this was a nice experience. Most of the kids who worked there were college and college-age kids from the New York area. So it was kind of a new slant on my education. Okay, the 50s. Well, during the 50s, I was, I was in undergrad for the early 50s and then through med school into the 50s. I don't know that anything was sort of radically different. This was after the war, and prosperity was sort of breaking out. I went on to intern. The Cold War was on, and I think there was a strong feeling that eventually we'd be at war with the Soviet Union. And of course Korea came along. I was too young for World War II, of course, and when Korea broke out, I was at camp, and we of course got the news, and by that time, gosh, I was 19, so we knew very much what was going on. So, and ironically, my mother sent me through the mail, I got my draft classification 1A, so, and people were being called in. When I got back home after that summer, this was 1950, I read that one of my classmates from high school had been called, he was in the Marine Corps Reserve, had been called in and was wounded. There was a piece in the paper where they quoted him. He was up near the Yalu River. I don't know if you know any of that history. That's when the Chinese came into the war and they surrounded a bunch of our troops. So, you know, the war, Korean War was very real. I was in college and later med school, so we were deferred a year at a time. And with the Korean War, it wasn't quite like World War II, where people felt almost guilty not being in it if they were of military age. it was more of like a chronic war, and the Cold War had been on, and although there was very little dissent, everybody wasn't lining up to go in the military. I did not drop out of med school to join the Army. I knew that I would probably have to go in when it was over, but they wanted me deferred. You know, the government wanted us to deferred and trained as doctors because they needed doctors worse than they needed foot soldiers. They could get plenty of those. In 1955, I graduated, and I went on to intern in New York, and started my residency.
What brought you to, why did you choose New York?
Well, frankly, I had, well, a couple of things. I wanted to leave Vanderbilt. I lived in Nashville all my life. I wanted to experience something else. My internship advisor knew the chief at Mount Sinai, chief of surgery, and he knew, I guess he assumed I was Jewish, and when I said I wanted to go to New York, he immediately suggested that. I applied to some other places.
Why is Mount Sinai a Jewish?
Yes, it's a Jewish hospital, like Mount Zion was. It's the biggest Jewish hospital in the country.
Does that mean they only serve Jewish patients?
No. I would say it's a huge hospital. It had, I think there were about 1,000 beds, which is bigger than anything around here. And a very prestigious hospital. It's right across from Central Park. New York, you have to understand, New York City was about, when I first started going there, I read the demographics, about 25% Jewish. And I would say our patient population was about 50% Jewish, because it was the most prestigious Jewish hospital in town, or
Where did you
in
live?
the country. Pardon?
Where'd you live?
In the hospital, in the quarters. It was kind of across the street.
It's Upper East Side, right?
What?
It's Upper East Side.
Actually, Upper East Side, yeah. 100th Street and Fifth Avenue. And where we lived was an old hospital building that wasn't being used, and they had rooms almost like dorm rooms, a two-door room. I'm still in touch somewhat with the guy that was my roommate. He's a surgeon. And then one of the reasons I went to New York is I had a serious girlfriend from camp who lived in New York. And at that time she was a student nurse at another hospital. But that broke up right away. And I went on, there was some upheaval at Mount Sinai, and although I was offered a residency, I went on to another hospital in New York, Maimonides in Brooklyn. And after about 5 months, though, I was called into the Air Force. And then I went overseas to England, where I served for 2 years. The Cold War was on.
So you recall that you were drafted in the Air Force?
Well, I joined something called the Berry Plan, and I got screwed up with the paperwork. I was supposed to be deferred for training in surgery. But when I switched to urology, they removed that and they called me in. I actually hadn't had any urological training. I had almost 1.5 years of surgical training. And
you hadn't done your residency?
I started it.
Where?
In New York. I
Wait, so you did your internship and your residency?
And 1.5 years of residency. So at the time I was called in. So I did not serve as a urologist or a surgeon. I was a general medical officer at a small base in England. I was.
What part of England?
I was a little more in, well, the air bases are out in the country. I was at a place called RAF Croughton. It was an old RAF base, and it was a communication base. And it was sort of about 18 miles north of Oxford.
So were the patients were people who were hurt in Korea and then?
No.
This is after the Korean War, right?
Korea, by that time, was over. I went in late '56. Korea,
So
I
how
think.
come you got drafted when there was no
Well,
war?
there was a Cold War. The draft was on.
Oh,
The draft was on constantly from before World War II to well after Vietnam.
I didn't know that.
And I actually was not drafted. I was in what's called a Berry plan, where they defer a certain amount of doctors to get specialty training, but then I got called in. I was in the reserve. So technically, I volunteered, but I would have been drafted. We were in double jeopardy because we were all eligible for the regular draft, and then there was something called Special Draft Number 1, which was the doctor's draft, and they could take you at a later age and in a worse physical condition. And actually, when I was on my way to report, I went to the draft board in Nashville, and my name was going to be up to next month, so I would have been drafted had I not been activated. So I served 2 years in the Air Force in England. Medically, it was a waste of time.
Did in all your medical school you have loans?
No.
You had no loans?
I lived at home. My parents paid my tuition. I did not have to go into debt. Part of the reasons I went to Vanderbilt was it was easier on my parents' pocketbook. They were not rich people. They were comfortable.
Did people live at home in college, in medical school?
Yeah.
Like now
Yes.
that almost never happens. Oh, if you go to state college.
The ones that were from town, now most of the students at Vanderbilt, I'd say 90% of students in undergrad and more than that in med school were not from Nashville, but other people who were from Nashville lived at home. And so it was a lot cheaper for my parents. Plus, in addition to that, Vanderbilt was considered the best in that part of the country. It was kind of like being from Palo Alto and not going to Stanford if you could get in. I don't think Vanderbilt is quite on par as Stanford, but that's the way it was regarded in the Southeast. And it certainly is arguably, when they do the rankings, it's up there in the top 20. Okay, where are we? We're in the Air Force.
You're in London, for
All right.
England.
I wasn't in London, I was out in the boonies.
Did you go through any training?
Well, they sent us to what's called basic orientation, and that was in the late October, first half of December of '56. Sent me to Montgomery, Alabama, Gunner Air Force Base, and for 3 weeks. And basically, we sat in lectures. This was for doctors, dentists, nurses, medical administrative officers. We didn't go out and
Was it
get shot at.
boot camp type training?
It wasn't like boot camp. We did do some drilling, and I had been in ROTC in high school, so I knew all the drills, knew them well. But we had a little bit of close order deal, I don't know why. And they taught us about the military. They didn't teach us any medicine. They sort of oriented you, and you got I remember getting the feeling after those 3 weeks. I'd been in an internship and residency where you were working 60, 80 hours a week and on every other night. And so this was vacation. We sat there and listened to lectures, and then every evening we were in the officers club partying. So it was a nice experience.
But they had doctors with no experience, other than you had a couple of years of an internship.
That's right. And the group I was in, this was the last orientation. They did orientation period. This was strictly Air Force. The Army sent them to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, the doctors. But the group I was in, there were about 30 doctors and about 70 dentists and about 100 nurses. So, but I would say the other doctors and dentists that I encountered there mostly were people without a lot of experience. And then there were, when I was in the Air Force, most of the people were just like me, young guys, early in their career. And there were a few regular Air Force guys And quite frankly, they were often people who either had trouble making it on the outside or wanted a soft life. The Air Force was very easy compared to residency or compared to private practice.
So you're done, now you're done with the 2-year thing? What-
Okay, while I was in England, I got a letter from my brother. It was toward the last of it that was really upsetting, and he told me that he had leukemia. And my mother had already died. My mother died in 1956 when I was still a resident. He didn't tell my dad or
Wait,
Aunt
how old
Mom.
was he, Irving?
When he got sick, let me think, 58, I think he was about 40. He made his own diagnosis. He palpated his spleen.
How did you know?
Well, he had it confirmed, of course.
No, but what told him?
He
How-
was feeling, in retrospect, he may have had it for a long time before that. Because he was in med school, he got mononucleosis twice, and one time was actually hospitalized. And he said often that leukemia was misdiagnosed as mononucleosis. I think he was feeling poorly, tiring easily, and then he palpated his spleen, and he suspected it, and he had blood counts, and then he went to an internist locally there, and then he went for
He
treatment.
was in California at this time?
Yeah, he was in California.
And he had gone to California after the...
After he got out, well, after he finished his residency, when Irving got out of the service, he went to Cincinnati to Cincinnati Jewish Hospital for his surgical residency, and that's where he met Doris.
Mhm.
And
Doris
how
was
big
in
is
there.
California?
He started working for a guy in Michigan. He was in Battle Creek, and he decided that the guy was a crook, a surgeon, and he was also exploiting him. So he said, look, I have a contract for a year, I'm going to leave at the end of the year. And the guy said, well, okay, if you're not going to stay, why don't you just leave? So he left, and he actually came home and lived with us for a while. He and Doris and Irving,
In Nashville?
Irving and Doris lived with us, and Harry and Ruth lived with us, and my mother and dad and me. So we were all, and then Molly.
And Harry and Ruth had kids at the time?
No. But they, I guess for economic reasons, they were living with her folks. So it was a very crowded house, and I remember we had a blizzard. Well, Irving, meantime, was shopping for a job, and he lived with us, they lived with us for a few months. And so finally, I guess he saw an ad, one of the medical journals, and he came out and interviewed, and it turned out that he went in with a couple of, a husband and wife, GP in Visalia. And that didn't work out either, because the guy turned out to be a crook.
Seriously though, Visalia's gross.
What?
It's gross.
What?
Visalia.
No, it was a nice little town when they lived there.
And this is when you were in medical school?
I was in med school. Actually, the day they left for California was I was taking exams for my 3rd year of undergrad, and I was accepted to med school. So Irving was already in California when I started med school.
Okay, so now we're back, you're in England, you got the letter.
Yeah.
So he went to
So
Visalia.
I already had, pardon?
He went to Visalia, then how did he get to the Bay Area?
He did. He practiced in Visalia.
Doris
Did Doris
got
move
the
to the
Bay
Bay Area after?
After he died.
Okay.
After he died.
Oh, did she move to the Bay Area to be by where you were?
I think that had something to do with it. I actually had a contract to go back to the hospital where I'd been before I went into the Air Force, and I wrote and broke that contract and applied to other places in California. When I heard about Irving's illness, I wanted to be close and help if I could, and so I was let out of the contract, and I took a job at Mount Zion in San Francisco in general surgery, and that was for about half a year. And I was already late for applying for urology, but I applied all around, and I had a job to stay there for another year.
This
Well,
is about
that's it.
56.
Yeah, no, this was 59 by this time. But I was accepted in urology at San Diego. And I stayed there for 2 years. And then I heard about Stanford, and I knew the guy from the Air Force who was going to be the chief of urology at Stanford. And I called him, and I came to Stanford for my last year.
Wait,
And
wait,
then-
wait. So wait, so you went to New York for the first part, where for the middle part?
San Diego.
Went into the service, and then I was in San Francisco for 6 months, then San Diego for a couple of years, and then Palo Alto.
Do people do that anymore? Like, do that many internships?
Not internship,
residence?
it's residency.
So it's pretty
Some,
simple.
it's not common, most people stay put, it's not common. But I got a variety of different experiences. Then Aaron Fink knew me from residency, and I also had an offer in San Francisco, and I had an offer to go back and take some informal training in Charleston, South Carolina, through a connection in San Francisco. This was two guys that had a booming practice, and they took like preceptors, guys that come and work with them for additional experience. But anyway, I decided to take the job with Aaron Fink in Mountain View, and so I went into practice.
On
And
Solace Place?
pardon?
On Solace Place?
No, I was near Monty for a while, 8 months, and then I was on South Drive. I'm sorry, I was on Hospital Drive. And after 10 years, I split up with Aaron Fink and went on my own. And then in 1967, a girl that I was dating, her parents were in town. We'd gone out the night before, and I broke a date because I didn't feel good. The next day I was supposed to go with her and her parents for dinner.
You booked a date with her or with somebody else?
No, with her. And decided to, then I felt a little better, decided to go to a party in San Francisco. And that's where I looked across the room and saw this bright-eyed
Bushy tail?
pretty girl, and that I decided I wanted to meet. She
What was your
had
pickup
moonlight
line?
in her eyes and a smile that lit up the room.
I thought you said breeding hips.
That was later, when
That was after she ate too few many bonbons?
no, after later on in the evening when she turned around. I was a joke, Pam, I was
What
kidding.
was your pickup line?
I just went over, a bunch of guys were around her and we were talking, I went over, joined the conversation and kept talking to her, and then later I asked her if she wanted to go out and get something to eat. Took her to this horrible place, somebody recommended in Chinatown, where we went up an alley and then up the stairs, and the waiter gave us a dirty plate, and when it was pointed out, he spit in it. Wife did, she'd never forgotten that. Anyway, and then
Did she
later,
eat off of it?
this was at a party that a Jewish singles group held at Paoli's. It was a nice restaurant, and the bar was a well-known pickup place, but the upstairs, there was a bar downstairs and a bar upstairs. The bar upstairs had been one of the synagogues had a youth groups. And then I think the following week.
Wait, what did you do with the chick that you just shined?
Oh, I continued to see her. And then the gal from New York that I'd broken up with had been married and got divorced and showed up out here too. Just suddenly called me up and said, I'm living in Sunnyvale now. So there were at least 3 girls I was seeing at the same time, plus maybe some others.
Did you intentionally not get married until later in life?
Intentionally? No.
Were you engaged to anyone else?
I had a very serious relationship with the girl in New York, and then I had some other
And what happened?
serious
That's
relationships.
because you went to London?
No, we broke up long before that. I had a relationship in New York, well, many of them in England, but then toward the last one somewhat serious one. And I had others here. It was not as though I didn't know any girls. It just, did I intentionally not get married? Not consciously. I was waiting for your mother, waiting for her to grow
How
up.
come you're so concerned about Spangy? This is on tape, so be careful.
Still concerned about,
Would you like to specify who Spangy is for the audience?
Dingalanus?
Joey? Oh, am I concerned? Yes. I'd like to see him settle down, but he's got to be ready. I don't know that that's part of the biography. Okay, we're up to I Knew Your Mother. I did not
He
date.
had 15 girlfriends.
So to go back for just a second, so you kind of skipped over the 60s.
About what the 60s. The 60s, I finished my residency, and then in 62, I went into practice. It was kind of tough because it was a young area. Urology thrives on older people.
And you were in San Francisco.
The community I went into went from 2 urologists to 5.
Wait, no,
3 of
you're
us.
in Mountain View, aren't you?
Pardon?
He's in Mountain View.
Yes, in Mountain View. What are you
So,
talking about?
How did you find the Bay Area during the 60s? And the
How did I
Vietnam
find it?
War?
Well, I was here twice. I was at Mount Zion in 59, and North Beach was swinging. It was the beatnik period. And I was telling your mother last night, because she remembered our second date. When I was a resident, I was on every other night, and I had no firm attachments, but I'd often go out the nights I was off. You could go down to North Beach, park your car, and
Now you can't do that.
no, I used to be able to park. And you could go into a place, the jazz workshop, a belly dancing place, what's the place where they sing opera? The place where the Condor is now was something else. And no cover, price of a drink, and listen to this music. And sometimes even pick up chicks. Okay.
So you're a regular?
So that's what San Francisco was like. Then I went to San Diego, which was a little different environment. San Diego's a little bit laid back. I had a quarters in the apartment, but in the hospital, but I also rented an apartment at the beach. I took over the apartment of an intern who was leaving. I think it was considered unfurnished. I bought his furniture, which was a bunch of crap. But anyway, it was $50 a month, 1-bedroom apartment. So, and by that time we were starting to get paid a little more. I didn't tell you this, but when I was an intern at Mount Sinai, we got room and board, all our meals. No, we got a meal allowance. They had changed it. We got room and board, our meals, some money for our meals, our laundry, and $25 a month. That was their salary. So I didn't have a lot of money. My parents were sending me money though. Okay, I
Take all your
left,
chicks out?
I beg pardon?
To date all your chicks?
In New York, yeah, but mostly I dated from the hospital. I was dating
How'd you have money to
a
date?
nurse. Well, we didn't go out expensive, and I had some, and I didn't have a lot of time. We were on every other night. Theoretically, we were on all the time, but somehow we worked it out that we had nights off.
Were you concerned at all that you were going to be recalled up for the Vietnam War?
I never really thought about it, no.
Did you know anybody who...
Well, the Vietnam War really hadn't started.
And he's too old. He's 35.
No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't.
57.
See, after I got out of the Air Force, which was late '58, I was in the reserve, had 6 more years. And when the Vietnamese War started, I was still in the reserve. And you had to, I thought I was out, but you had to write and say you wanted to resign. I really didn't think about that because they weren't generally calling people who had already military service. They were calling up at least doctors, all the doctors who had not served. Some of my contemporaries, had not been in it and were called up. See, the draft was on, even, the Vietnamese War just started kind of gradually. It wasn't like Pearl Harbor that bang, we're at war. It was, we had a few advisors when the Korean War was going on and the French were fighting the communists. And so as we got deeper and deeper involved, they had to call up people. But their draft was on because the Cold War was on. We were all being trained, and we had lots of troops in Europe. And periodically there was a blow up in the Middle East. There was the Hungarian uprising and the Suez War in the Middle East just when I was called to go in the service. And then about the time I was to get out of the service, there was some blow up in Jordan and Lebanon, and some troops were pulled out of our, pardon?
1967 was the whatever 6-day or 3-day war, whatever.
Well, yeah, but that I was not in. This was 58. So, but the Cold War was going on all the time, and when I was in residency, and I really didn't worry about being called out. No.
Did you have an opinion of the war?
I have to admit, at the time, I thought it was a good thing, and in retrospect, I have to say we didn't accomplish anything because
Why did you think it was a good thing?
the communists were trying to extend, and I
why
think
did
to
you-
this day, Stalin wanted to rule the world. And Truman put a stop to it in several places. And I think at the time, just when I started practice, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't think we realized how close we were to a major war, and it probably would have been a nuclear war. Kennedy called his bluff, said we're going to stop the ships, and he backed down. This was Khrushchev. This was Stalin was gone. But I don't think young people today can appreciate what the perceived and probably real peril was at the time. We've got it in a different manner now, but certainly the communist threat was real. And unfortunately it was overdone by people like McCarthy, where they were seeing communists where there were no communists, and a lot of good people were castigated. And there was a lot of polarization. Okay, where are we?
Also, in the 60s, there was the civil rights movement. Were you involved
Civil
in that?
rights movement was going on, and I thought that was a good thing. And,
Were you
Women's
involved
rights?
particularly about that?
directly, no, because nothing was going on out here.
How about as segregation changed the South? Were you or your family involved in that at all?
Well, I was in med school in 1954, which was a Supreme Court decision to desegregate the schools, and that was really somewhat of a blockbuster. There had been agitation and movements. People were certainly supportive of desegregation, but you know, when you grow up and people ask me what was it like to segregate, I grew up with segregation, and when you grow up and from your earliest time, they go to different schools, and you just don't, in your everyday, although you do come in contact with them. I didn't tell you this, but when I was a little boy, although we lived right next to the store, my mother was involved in the business, and we had a colored woman who was a maid, and she worked for us and took care of me, and she was a surrogate mother. She took me all day long. She was like your nanny, except she didn't live in. She stayed with us. And my brother and sister had similar situations, a different woman, but we had the same woman through all my childhood. And then, you know, by the time I don't know at what age, I no longer needed a nanny. But I have very fond memories of her and her taking me out for walks and bathing me. Pardon? Yeah.
What was her name?
Claudie. That's what I called her, Claudie. In fact, I don't remember this, but my dad told me about it, that at one point, I remember hugging her and kissing her after a bath. You know, as I say, she was although I never felt that I was neglected by my mother, because my mother was certainly around, and definitely she was my mother, but I was very attached to this woman, and vice versa. I think she was attached to me. I don't remember this, but they tell the story that at one time I got some white shoe polish and I was trying to paint Claudie white. So somewhere I had gotten the idea from the environment, you know. My family were not terribly prejudiced, but they were not what you would consider flaming liberals today. But certainly the kids I came in contact with, that's just the way it was in the South then. I got the idea somewhere that it was better to be white than black, and I loved this woman, and so I wanted to make her white. So I don't remember that. My folks told me that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we were out in the '60s in the civil rights. Oh, when they passed the Supreme Court decision to integrate the schools, they did nothing in Nashville. I mean, nobody knew what to do. It wasn't that much of a problem because the blacks pretty well lived in their neighborhood, and the whites, even the working class whites, lived in their neighborhood. There were some around the fringes intermixing. I mean, it wasn't a ghetto wall, but they were just by tradition or desire, they lived separately. So going to different schools didn't seem unnatural. I left in '55. I left the South and went to New York, where they had the segregated neighborhoods. You know, in fact, the hospital where I was at was right in what was called Spanish Harlem. I didn't tell you this. You asked if the patients were mostly Jewish. About half the patients were Jewish, and many of the rest were Puerto Rican. It was a big Puerto Rican neighborhood by that time.
That's up by Columbia University?
Pardon? No, Columbia's on the other side. It's not far from Cornell med school. Columbia is on the upper west side. I went to some parties over there, people that I knew.
Okay, so back to the '60s, you're dating like 27 women.
Not 27, but I didn't date your mother exclusively.
Did she know that?
What?
Did she know that?
She does that?
Yeah. No, she knows that. She knows that. As a matter of fact, well, I won't go into that. She knew I was seeing other women and girls, and she was dating too. Sort of as the summer went on, I was very interested, and I was seeing more and more of her, and I guess at some point I told her I was serious about the relationship. I don't remember the exact words I used, and at some point we were planning a wedding. I think we started planning it late in '67. I don't know at what time. Neither one of us can say exactly when we decided to get married or who asked who. I know I didn't have a ring for a while. My mother had 3 rings. She had a wedding ring, an engagement ring, and had a ring that my dad had given her on the 25th anniversary. She wore on the other hand, the dinner ring. So when she died, she had let my aunt know, and as I say, these sisters were very close, that she wanted those given to each of the 3 children. Well, my brother and sister were married, and they said they sort of waived their rights to it. So Aunt Molly said they were mine. I told
You have all 3 of them?
all 3 of them.
Because she only wears 2.
No, I'll tell you what happened to her. I told you when we decided to get married, I told your mother that I had those, and she wasn't so sure. that she wore. I said if she want to pick out a ring. In fact, we actually went shopping. We went to several jewelry stores looking at rings and learning about the different cuts. And Aunt Molly was in business, as my dad, and she had them in a safe deposit box. And it was near Christmas, I remember that, and she didn't have time to go to the bank and get the stuff out. And then after the first of the year, she did, sent them through the mail, uninsured, which was kind of foolhardy. Anyway, your mother liked them. The settings were old. She's to this day wearing my mother's engagement ring in a new setting. And the wedding ring, we had it was several diamonds, and we had that cut out and remounted, and then we bought matching rings. And then the other ring that she had, we made a pendant out of it, and somehow I think we even got some diamond earrings out of my mother's rings. Now, several times I've offered, when my parents were first married, they couldn't afford this ring. It's slightly under a carat, and my mother had a different ring, and then as they developed some means, my mother got this ring, but it's a very old ring, and several times I've offered your mother to buy her a new diamond, and she's got a sentimental attachment. We've had it appraised, and the guy said it's an old cut, and it actually had a little chip in it, so I've offered her a new ring, but your mother has a sentimental attachment. In fact, she lost one of the diamonds out of the wedding ring and left it with me to have it replaced, and I was going to have the whole thing redone, and it was at the jeweler's. When she came back, she was out of town, and she really got angry with me, and I got it back from the jeweler before he'd done anything. So anyway, where are we? I married your mother. As I say, we had
You didn't
known
know her for that long.
a little over a year. I met her
No,
in,
'cause you met her in '67.
all right, I met her in February of '67,
Oh.
and we dated intermittently, not exclusively, and through the summer it became a little more intense. And then at some point we decided to get married, but they hadn't planned the wedding. And there's something, when she wanted to get married in her parents' synagogue, and there was something about a holiday and period when you couldn't get married. So anyway, that's how it happened. We married in April. So I met her in February of '67. We got married in April of '68. And then in April of '69, we had a little bundle of joy. Pam.
That you wanted to be a boy.
Pam, that was a joke. I think had I had my
I
druthers,
said that at my wedding.
that I know I was saying, you don't know when I'm trying to be funny. I think if the typical American dream is you get married, you have a son, and then you have a daughter. So I kind of wanted a boy. We didn't know, but I think it took about 1 hour for me to fall in love. When I went to your mother's room, she had you there and
Took
feeding
a
you,
full hour?
and then she
I had to take my first
said,
down
"Here,
probably.
you want to hold your daughter?" And I put her up here, and she put her head on my shoulder and her head next to mine, and I fell in love.
What was going to be my name if I was a boy?
I think probably, I don't know if we'd even discussed it. You're named after my mother.
I
you
know.
So it might have been Paul.
But there was already a Paul.
Well, or some derivative there, or it still could have been Paul. There are, in my mother's family, my mother's mother's name was the English equivalent, was Ruth. There were 4 Ruths. There's Ruth Rothman, Uncle Louie's daughter, Ruth Witt, who's Aunt Sarah's daughter, Ruth Estelle, Aunt Molly's girl who died, and my sister, who was Shirley Ruth. So there's nothing, and there were 2 Lesters. So nothing to say you couldn't. I think Irving, until he got sick, they were planning another child, and it was going to be, my mother had died in the interval, and it was going to be Paul or Paula.
Wait, because they were going to adopt another kid?
No, they adopted Mimi because Doris had difficulty conceiving, and then almost immediately, not immediately, after they had Mimi, they found out that, and Doris got pregnant with Judy. And they were gonna have another one. And once Irving got sick, he said, you know, he was very realistic. Said, I'm gonna leave her with 2 young children. I don't want any more burden on her. So they.
How old were the kids when he died?
When Irving died, Mimi was 11 and Judy was 9. And I was the one that had to tell him.
What'd you say?
Well, Irving was in the hospital. I was in practice up here. And Pete Browner, that was his friend, another doctor, called, and I was about to go into surgery. And he told me that Irving was really very bad, you ought to get down here. He had just gone in the hospital, I think, the night before. I had been down there twice within the previous month, fortunately, just as happenstance. It was around Thanksgiving. I went down just periodically. They invited me down to visit, and I went down for a weekend and invited me to come back for Thanksgiving. I went back for 1 day. I had patients on Friday, so I drove back. And then 2 weeks later was when he died, and when he turned bad. Well, I went ahead and did my surgery, and then I had another phone call. Pete said, you really better get down here. I think it's now. So I turned the patient over to my associate. I went to the bank to get some money and took a shower, and packed some clothes and drove down there. He was still alive, but he was kind of semi-comatose. He spoke to me. I don't know if he was aware of my presence. And he died that night. And Doris was pretty broken up, although she said, I've been preparing myself for this for years, but how will I ever take my children?
Wait, how many years have you been knowing?
6.5 years that he was sick, since the diagnosis. And he worked right up to the last with various degrees. He went into remission for a while. But, you know, he was on treatment, he was on medication, he was getting blood transfusions, he was still doing surgery. When he died, he had post-op patients in the hospital. So that's how quickly it happened. But Doris said, how will I ever tell my children? And Pete said, I'll tell them. And then I spoke up and said, I'll tell them. And they were at the next door neighbors, and I went there, and the neighbor, who was a pilot, he did crop dusting, so looked in my face, and they knew he was bad, and I shook my head, and then I went and sat down with him. And the way I presented it, I know Mimi knew about people going to heaven. And I said, I know you know that your dad's been very sick, and he's gone, went to heaven tonight. And he became hysterical. Judy was 9, and I think and she's different personality. The full impact didn't really hit her, but Mimi took it very hard. And still. Okay, where are we now?
Anything else?
We're in I met your mother.
You only have one kid.
I have 1 kid. Then your mother got pregnant pretty soon afterwards. And, you know, she had a miscarriage at about 20 weeks, which is late.
You were living in your house at this point?
Yeah. Oh, well, we lived in, she didn't want to live in my bachelor pad, which was on Latham in Mountain View. Although I had a nice 1-bedroom apartment. It was mostly swinging singles there, but you know, she could have lived there. And I asked her that, and she really didn't want to live there. So while I was working, this is before we got married, she scouted around, found an apartment. We lived in Sunnyvale on something court. It was in one of these garden apartment buildings. It was off Bernardo, the other side of El Camino, where there were a lot of apartments. And I said we could buy a house eventually. And we were having trouble with the manager, you know, they didn't want us to have kids over. You know, I think my
Wait,
nieces.
but you already have one kid, or no?
No, I didn't have any
No.
kids. It was my nieces came over to swim. It was adults only, and there were all kinds of restrictions. So I'd not been particularly interested in buying a house that quickly. I said, whenever you're ready, we'll look for a house. Anyway, your mother scouted out and looked at houses with real estate people. Mel Getz Sr. found one. He was in real estate. He found one for us, which we were going to buy, but the guy had liens on it. It was just the other side of Foothill Expressway, sort of around where Mrs. Thornikoff's place is. Anyway, she found a few houses that, you know, after work I'd go and look at. And then we looked at the house that we ultimately bought, and she really liked it. It was only a mile from my office. The only thing wrong with it was at the time was painted this direct brown, which turned me off. But she really liked the house, and we looked around. We went back in the master bedroom, and she said, you know, we had already made an offer on this house that had liens on it, so we couldn't get clear title. The guy had liens, and it had been beat up a little bit. I think it was a blessing in disguise that we didn't get that one. And we made an offer, and we dickered back and forth, and we bought the
Except it would have
house.
been in Los Altos Hills, which would have had better value, probably.
Well, it wasn't the hill. I don't know if it was the hills or not. Probably. It was just off of Fremont, which later became Foothill Expressway. It was just the other side, up there around downtown Los Altos. Maybe it would have had better value. The house had some rambunctious teenagers, and they had doors broken and things. And the backyard was not landscaped. There was still orchard in it. So anyway, we bought this. Your mother really liked the house, and after making a couple of back and forth offers, we bought it. It makes you sick to know what we paid for it originally.
What'd you pay for it?
1968, $51,000 plus closing costs. And that was more, I think it cost something like $42,000 new 3 years earlier. But they'd done landscaping and carpets and drapes. Let's see, what else? Well, we had Pam, then we had the miscarriage, and I think about a week after, or a few days after the miscarriage, my dad died. And so I went back for just a day or two because your mother had this miscarriage.
What did she die of? He died of?
It's hard to say. You know, he was in a nursing home, and he died in his sleep.
What did your mom die of?
My mother had severe heart trouble. She also had multiple myeloma, which she never knew about. But what she died of was terminal heart failure. Well, we had the miscarriage.
Is that a risk to her family?
Yeah, my mother had high blood pressure for years. She was slightly overweight.
Go ahead.
Okay. My mother, as I recall, had hypertension, high blood pressure, for years, and she was always a little overweight. I don't know about cholesterol or when they started measuring that. I know we certainly had it when I was in med school, and we knew that it was a risk factor. But anyway, my mother developed valvular and coronary disease and died of heart failure. She also had a diagnosis. She had an anemia which had defied diagnosis, and they finally made a diagnosis of multiple myeloma. She never knew that. My brother thought she didn't need to know that. But anyway, I think she died of just terminal heart failure, and perhaps even was having angina. She died when I was in New York in my first year residency. And my dad, it's not clear what he died from. He was kind of becoming confused. I think he was,
How old was he?
he died in the year Joey was born, so that would have been 1970. He was 78, maybe 77, going on 78. And, you know, he just had, I think he died in his sleep and had been going downhill.
And both your mother and father died in Nashville?
Yeah, in Nashville, they're buried in Nashville. Okay, we're back to our kids. I told you about the first little bushy head bundle that your mother handed me, and I fell in love. And she was the cutest little thing, and she had a full head of black hair at birth. And then my mother got, your mother got pregnant fairly soon. I don't remember the time interval. And then early in 1970, she miscarried at 20 weeks, which is unusual. It was a late miscarriage, and it's probably something to do with the bicornate uterus that she has. So we lost that baby, and it was a boy. But then, I guess I remember I went back for my dad's funeral when your mother was still recuperating, and I didn't stay very long because I didn't want to leave your mother alone. And we already had Pam. Pam was not even a year old. Anyway, somehow she got pregnant again, and the results were Joey about 20 months after Pam was born. We could have had even closer with the pregnancy that she lost. And Pam was kind of a little bit of a pain from the very beginning, temper tantrums and, you know.
What do you expect when you have that many kids?
No, Pam, we didn't have any
I
kids
didn't
then.
have temper tantrums before Joey came along.
You had temper tantrums. Anyway, if you woke up and didn't get your bottle right away. Joey was really a very nice little guy until the new baby started to compete. Anyway, about 20 months after Joey, we had the next one, and as you know, we did not expect twins. Dave was born, and then we're waiting for the afterbirth, the placenta, and they have your mother on Pitocin drip. Finally, the obstetrician explored the uterus and said, "My God, I think I'm shaking hands with another baby." So they put your mother to sleep, took her down in the elevator, and did a cesarean section for Eric. Your grandparents were there at our house taking care of Pam and Joey. I think we had Joey, and I think at that time we had already hired Jeannie because we knew we were going to have another baby. And I was supposed to call your grandparents to let them know that everything was okay after it was over. But when this surprise happened, I said, I can't tell them that over the phone. So I got in my car, and as you know, we don't live very far. I drove home, and it was in the summer. Yeah, summer. And they were sitting outside on the patio in the back, and everybody was there. Jean and Pam was there. I don't think, and they looked worried when they saw me. And I said, first of all, let me tell you, Binky's okay, because I'm sure that's what they were worried about. She had lost a lot of blood during this double whammy, and she was asleep. And then I told them what happened. I told them about the delivery and about finding the new baby and going and getting a C-section. And I hadn't really emphasized the fact that there were two babies. But Pam, despite the fact that she threw temper tantrums, she was a pretty smart little thing. And when she got stressed, she sucked her thumb. And I remember very discreetly, she was standing there, and I wasn't paying attention to her. I was saying all this for the benefit of your grandmother and grandfather. Pam stuck her thumb in the mouth and she said, "But I already have a brother, I needed a sister," because she heard that she had 2 boys. So anyway, that's where you all came from. And we had a series of au pairs, and my practice thrived. I was very busy through those years. I went solo, and that was tough, 21 years solo. And then when we were in Hawaii, I started thinking seriously about retirement. And I don't know if you remember when we all went to Hawaii on your mother's passes. You remember your mother went back to fly, and one of the side benefits you got was passes. And then you all went off to college, and one by by 2, and we were alone, and it was a kind of a different environment. And then I'm trying to think who, I think some of you came back for a while. But anyway, I think Eric,
It's already almost done.
it's over.
It's flashing again, so it'll be over in a second.
Yeah.
So, you know, Eric got married first, and then a year later, David got married, and we acquired Steffi, and we acquired Laura, and then I think a year after that, Pam got married, and we acquired Eric, and then we started acquiring grandchildren, first Paulina, then, then Antonia, and then shortly thereafter Hayden, and now we have a new arrival on the way, and we all live happily ever after. Anything else? I understand we're coming close to the end. Anything else you want to ask about?
Questions. Do you want to?
We covered them, I think. Let's see.
You've got all of the family. Oh, as far as Irving's family, I think you know Mimi and Judy, and then Ruth has Rob, and then Paul, and some of the other cousins. I could tell you about their children if you want the family tree.
Let's see. And this, and
Do you
then
have anything specific you want to ask?